Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Always honored to have Dr. Brian McVeigh back. And we're going to be talking about Japan and psychology today. So, Brian, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Shrikant, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I am going to show some slides, and maybe I'll put those up now to get started with that. Okay, so can everyone see that all right?
Brian, it is showing as two slides. So I think there is a display settings where you have to show, it's a big slide showing and a small slide, next slide showing up.
Yeah, I don't know why it's doing that.
There are some display options that you will have.
Right.
Where you can go ahead and show only one slide so people can see it more clearly.
Right. I don't know. I hit the slide show. I'm not sure why it did that.
Okay, let's go back. Let's go back. Just stop the slideshow.
Okay.
Okay, let's start the slides again.
Okay.
All right, and now go to, let's see, go to slideshow, pull down the slideshow.
This icon right here.
You can see, no, you can just go to the slideshow. There is a menu up there. Yeah.
Up here?
Yeah. Yeah, a slideshow, yeah.
Oh, is this it here?
No, it says animations followed by slideshow.
Oh, okay.
And say from beginning.
Okay. And then
is it showing? Yeah. No, it's not showing yet. Yeah, go ahead. You can click on that. Yeah, perfect. Perfect.
Okay. So let's so as I said, welcome everybody. So today, let me just give a few words of where this podcast is coming from. Some years ago, I had a plan to write a book about psychology in post-war Japan. And I said to myself, before I do that, I should first do some background research on the history of psychology in Japan. And so I started a small project looking at how psychology emerged as a discipline in the 19th century in Japan. And that actually turned out to be a book. And I don't know if you can see this, but we talked about this last time, actually, this book here, History of Psychology, History of Japanese Psychology. And the upshot is I never got around to completing the original project, which was, as I said, a project on post-war Japan. So what today's talk is about, this is just going to highlight some key themes from that book that I never wrote on post-war Japanese psychology. So let's ask the question, what does it mean to institutionalize the individual in Japan? That's a key theme today's talk. And for some reason, this is not cooperating.
If you just click on it, and then you can click left arrow or right arrow. You can just click, yeah. You can just click and then use the arrow keys in order to, yeah, there.
Yeah, the arrow keys aren't working for some reason.
Okay.
But well, in any case, so the theme of today's talk is Japan as a psychologized society in world perspective. So even though I'm going to give some examples, many examples from Japan, at the same time, I want everyone to be thinking about how Japan fits into what we might call a global psychology. The next theme is this word, it's a sort of an ugly word, psychologicality. And that is a consequence of intensified conscious interiority. So I'm going to assume that most of you have heard my previous talks about Julian Jaynes and what he means by conscious interiority, what I mean by it. If not, some of today's talk may not make too much sense, but in any case, hopefully it will. But in any
just a note to people who are listening to this on YouTube: if you have not listened to the Jaynes talk, go to the Jaynes playlist, and we have a whole series on core concepts on Julian Jaynes. Watch that first, and then continue with this video. Thank you.
Okay, and so conscious interiority, and if you'll remember that when I have talked about that in the past, I talked about how there are about a dozen features of conscious interiority, and conscious interiority is a package of those features, and it doesn't really make sense unless you break down conscious interiority into these different aspects or features. Today, one feature in particular that I want to focus on is this idea of self-individuation. Basically, that just means to give how the individual gives a lot of attention to the mental contents, what is unique, what is special about an individual. It sort of overlaps, I suppose, with the idea of individuality or individualism. But what's important to keep in mind is that we take individualism for granted, I think, especially in Euro-American traditions. But this idea of focusing on the individual actually is a recent historical way of looking at things. So we want to keep that in mind. All right. So, as I said, today's talk is really sort of an introduction to a project on Japan as a psychologized or psychologizing society. And again, just to repeat, the way I look at things, societies were not really psychologized, we might say, until about 150, 200 years ago. So what does that mean concretely? Just to give you some context. Well, a first feature of a psychologized society would be a turn inward, and to look at the individual as a basic self-contained unit of politics and economics. You know, typically, again, we think this focus on the individual is a Western idea. I don't think it's so much a Western idea. I think it's more of a modern idea, actually, as societies, especially when they begin to industrialize and introduce modern politics, you're going to see a focus on the individual. And this is all part of a larger process of the conscious interiorization that we see going on around the world. Another feature is emotionalism, intensive nuance focus on one's sentiments and feelings. And again, we may take our emotions for granted, I suppose. But I think that if we could study the history of how people look at emotions, we would find that we are becoming more emotional beings. And again, that's a little bit vague, but we can maybe talk about that later on. Also highlighting cognitive processes. Well, basically, that's what the study of psychology is. Psychology as a discipline focuses on cognitive processes. For my purpose, of course, I focus on consciousness or conscious interiority, and listed here are some features of conscious interiority that we've talked about before in the past: self-narratization, individuation, self-reflexivity, self-autonomy, self-authorization. And then another aspect of the modern psychological landscape is what we can call therapism or therapy culture. And the idea is that social ills and personal problems can be solved through some type of psychotherapy. Again, we can't take that for granted. We can't assume that has always been the case. Of course, a type of psychotherapy did start to develop in the late 1800s, so it's been around for a while. But I would make the argument that even in the last 20 or 30 years, therapism, or a culture of therapy, has become more prominent. It's become more salient. at least in the Euro-American tradition, and I think also in Japan. So I could give many examples of what I mean, but to illustrate this point, but just one example. I don't know when it started, but anytime there's a horrible school shooting or some sort of tragedy, when it's reported on the news, they'll often say counselors have been sent to the location, or counselors are standing by for people who might need some psychotherapy because of they've been traumatized or whatever. That's a recent thing. I don't remember years ago hearing that. So that's just one instance of how we view everything through a therapeutic lens. And I think what propels us to do that, of course, is this growth of conscious interiorization. Another aspect, unique self, again, to express one's individuality by pursuing consumerist desires. That also is related to the intensification of conscious interiority. And then, of course, psychology itself as a discipline. And as we know, psychology did not become a scholarly discipline until the mid-late 19th century. This is not to say that people throughout the centuries did not study something like psychology, but really what we think of psychology did not exist until the late 19th century, because that is when we started to focus on the human mind in a scientific manner. That's when we started to believe that we could actually understand cognitive processes through measurement. So before the 19th century, people, philosophers, I suppose, would talk about something like psychology, but it is not the way we understand it. And unfortunately, I think many undergrads, when they take a course in the history of psychology, they're really given, I think, a sort of distorted view of the history of psychology, because they'll often start back with Plato or Socrates or something and talk about, or Aristotle, talk about as if these ancient Greek individuals were talking about psychology as we understand it. There's some overlap, but they really were not talking about the modern discipline of psychology as we think of it. So that's important to keep in mind. So the next slide. So I'm making all these grand claims that some people might question or dispute. And so I think it's a fair question. Can this be backed up? Can my claims be supported empirically in some way, which is, of course, very difficult to do. But I think one place to look is language. And I haven't really delved into this too deeply, because if I did, I would look at not just English, but I would look at a number of languages, including Chinese and Japanese for that matter. But in any case, this chart here, this is a pretty simple chart. It just looks at two words, the growth in the use of psychology and psychological. And if you trace the words, just going back to 1800, you can see a dramatic rise, actually. So there is something going on there. And if you look, especially the turn of the early 20th, by the turn of the 20th century, it starts to rise up. And then by the time you get 1920, 1940, it sort of peaks a little bit, and then it rises again throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And so in any case, clearly something is going on there. Whether this is enough evidence or not to support my claim that conscious interiority, or it's an ugly word, but psychologicality is increasing. I mean, this is all debatable, but we have to start somewhere with some sort of empirical base. So again, to try and be a bit scientific, the hypothesis, as years pass, conscious interiority, or in broader terms, psychologicality, has increased. So what I've done here is I've looked at a number of words: mental, consciousness, psychological, conscious psychology, therapeutic mentality, introspection, introspect, therapy, and some of these words a little more convincing than others. For example, the word mental or conscious and psychological, you can trace these words and you can see actually they have increased, especially in the late 19th century, especially from 1850. And then when you get, then after 1900, you see some dramatic rises. And interestingly enough, some words sort of decrease in usage, but overall in the aggregate, I think it supports my hypothesis. So to kind of continue with this this attempt to show that empirically my claims can be supported, what I've done is I've looked at 3 historical periods. The first one, the longue durée, from around 1600 to 2000, then what we might call the modern period, 1800 to 2000, and then the late modern period, 1950 to 2000. And using Google Books Ngram Viewer, I came up with 5 clusters: mental, mentality, introspection, introspective, introspect, psychology, psychological, therapy, therapeutic, conscious, consciousness. So again, these are sort of a collection of words that I think indicate the degree of conscious interiority. And the next several slides have to do with statistics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just to reiterate what I just said, we're looking at 5 clusters and how these clusters have increased in use over time. And the 3 time periods we're looking at, of course, are the 3 time ranges listed at the top of the slide. So again, I'm not going to spend time on this. This is the statistics. If anyone is interested in this, please, you can contact me or stop the YouTube presentation and look at it to see if my math is correct. But I just want to show you, again, I'm trying to be as rational and empirical as possible. There is some math behind my claims. And basically, I came up with correlations. And I came up with 15, I guess you could say I came up with 15 hypotheses that those clusters were increasing over those 3 periods. And it's the result is 11 out of 15 of the hypotheses were supported. The correlations were supported. About 73% support the claim that psychologicality is increasing through history, especially those 3 periods that we talked about before. So it's not overwhelming evidence, but statistically, I certainly think that it's significant. So now let's now that we got that out of the way, let's look at why this focus on the individual has become so important. And again, if you remember from previous discussions of Jaynes, the idea here is that as societies become more complex, what is happening inside the individual psyche will become more complex, not just in terms of neurology, but also in terms of culture, what we might call looking at things from a cultural psychological perspective. So the idea here, modern societies are composed of expanded organizational structures. Well, that's going to put pressure on the individual to become more complex. So at the same time, societies become increasingly rooted in individual persons, so that organizations are structured in terms of individual persons rather than corporate groups. So this is sort of it's a little bit awkward, I think. But the idea here, what's being said is that as modern society can be defined as belonging to many different organizations. whether they're economic or political, whatever the case may be. And the more organizations we belong to, of course, that means it's going to make things more complicated in terms of psychology. And what that leads to is more self-individuation, which is a key feature of conscious interiority. So modern life, we might say postmodern life, is built around the project of the individual. And the individual has become the modern source of all meaning and action. Not everybody would agree with that. That certainly is disputable. But in any case, that's sort of the claim that I'm making here. And in a few minutes, I'll give some examples from Japan. And by the way, that Japanese, Chinese ideogram, it's, in Japanese it's pronounced kosei, means individuality. And I just put it up there because when I first started many years ago to study Japan, I was told that, well, the Japanese do not prize the individual or individuality, that it's a very group oriented society. And when I went and I lived in Japan, I studied in Japan, I mean, that's just completely not true. Of course, groups do play a big role in Japan, as they do in many societies, but so does the individual, especially this idea of kosei, of individuality. So I just want to point that out. So the individual is, let's see, the primordial or grounding element of all social structures in the modern world. It's the core element, the sovereign source of public life, whether political, economic, or cultural, as well as the source of problems in these areas. So again, hopefully this is clear what I'm trying to say. It all fits together. The more conscious interiority we have because of modern complexity, the more self-individuation we're going to have. And basically self-individuation in this context means a focus on the individual. So supposedly there's a celebration of the individual that is found in, someone uses that term, Anglo-Protestant countries. I don't know if that's just a quote from someone else. I don't know if I'd use that term myself, but in any case, the idea is that there's the hegemonic source of individualism is found in certain societies in Northern Europe. But my claim is that actually it's not just in Northern Europe or North America or what some people might call the West. I think this celebration of the individual actually is a worldwide phenomenon. And not to sound repetitive, that's because the human species, according to Jaynes, is becoming more and more conscious. And what that means, of course, is open to discussion. Okay, wait a second, this is not working again. However, charting the landscape of conscious interiority, or what we might call psychologicality in Japan, demonstrates that there too, social structures are becoming increasingly designed to articulate the interior structure of the individual. The interior structure of the individual. So as you can see, that word interior overlaps very much with the term I like to use, conscious interiority. So the idea here is that organizations are being reconfigured in order to articulate or to respond to the demands of individuality or individualism or self-individuation, however you want to express it. And we can call this institutionalized individualism. So institutionalized individualism is not a Western phenomenon. It is operating, I believe, at the worldwide level. It's more obvious in other places than others, but I do think it's a global phenomenon. And so that's why now we have an increasing emphasis on therapeutic measures, or as I've mentioned before, this idea of therapy culture or therapism. Again, psychotherapy has been around, depending how you want to define it, for 150 years, I suppose. But my argument is that if you look at the evidence, it has increased, especially since the war, and even more so the past several decades. There's what has emerged is a therapy culture, more focus on a person's mental well-being, more concern about what we might call emotionalism. How is someone doing emotionally? And I think we become so used to that sort of culture that perhaps we take it for granted. But if we step back and look at things in grand historical perspective, as I've tried to do, using a Jaynesian framework, we can see that we get a better measure of how we are changing as psychological beings. So to turn to Japan, in Japan, they actually use this word, emotivism, shinjo shugi. And also they use the word psychologism, shinri shugi. Those words actually are not always used positively. You know, the idea is perhaps we're giving too much attention to the individual, perhaps we're giving too much attention to the psychological experiences of the individual. But in any case, that's again, that's all very debatable. But I just want to introduce a couple of Japanese terms to show that in Japan, they also are having similar debates and discussions about the role of psychologism. So something, I'm going to be giving some examples of this in a moment, but so how, again, we have to focus on measurement, on making these claims. So we have to focus on, can I support the claims that I'm making? And one way to do that is to look at professionalization of psychology. So how many psychologists are there? How many counseling organizations are there? At the daily level, how often are Japanese exposed to, how often do they encounter what we might call psychologism? And one way, of course, to do this is to look at the increase in what I call psi organizations, any type of organization that has the, in English, that would be prefaced with the term psi. And something else that I won't spend too much time looking at, but I'll just mention it now, this idea of what we can call psychotherapeutic religions in Japan. And of course, that's a whole nother debate, to what degree, not just in Japan, but in any modern society, are religions fulfilling um, a psychotherapeutic function? And I'll just mention that. Maybe we can talk about that later. So again, to get back to Japan, school counseling has really taken off in Japan. So the question is how Japan's educational culture has responded to professional psychologization. I think they're actually a little bit behind the United States. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, of course, is debatable. But certainly they are following similar trajectory to the United States, where they are viewing problems among students or problems in schools as not necessarily just educational or pedagogical problems, but viewing them as problems that need some sort of psychotherapeutic application. Another example, and again, we see this not just in Japan, we see this especially in affluent societies, the projection of human emotional needs into pets, granting animals a richer inner life than they possess. And not to get anyone upset, I love dogs as much as anyone, but I do think, and dogs, don't get me wrong, are very emotional beings. They're quite clever and sophisticated psychologically in their own way. However, they are not humans, obviously, and they do not possess the rich inner life, I think, that a human individual possesses. Nevertheless, the point being that in Japan, and I've seen this in China too, I mean, I think all over the world, as societies become richer and richer, you will see this sort of anthropomorphization, for lack of a better word, or you might say an interiorization or projection of human psychology into animals. So when I looked around in Japan to see what if you have this what we might call the genre of self-help books, because often, at least in the United States, self-help books have a very psychological cast to them. And I was wondering if that's the case in Japan. And again, this is a little more anecdotal. This is not terribly, this is not as scientific as it should be. But certainly there is something going on in Japan that resonates, I think, with similar trends that we see in the United States. So this book here, The Healing of Connection, the Development of Therapy Culture. And by the way, Shimazono Susumu, he is a scholar. I met him once. He actually is a scholar of religious studies. So it is very interesting overlap here between religion and psychology. The sociology, this is another example of a book, The Sociology of Therapy Culture, Network Business, Self-Development, Trauma. Looks at psychology from different angles. The Way of Living of the Therapist, Healing People is Healing Yourself. Another book, The Era of Self-Development. So again, there's sort of a focus on the self, Jiko. And that overlaps, of course, with this idea that I've mentioned many times of self-individuation, the cultural, sociological search for self, again, a focus on the self. Only modern, postmodern, rich societies can afford to be focused on the self. And so the argument is the richer a society is, the more focus you'll see on the self. The more postmodern, you might say, a society is, the more focus you'll see on the self or the individual. And of course, this is just because Jaynesian conscious interiority is unfolding. It's an example of that development. The globalization of knowledge about the heart and the ideal of the autonomous individual, the sanctification management of the heart. Okay, so again, the heart, just like in Japanese, as in many languages, is sort of is a metaphor for your core psychological being. Notice the ideal of the autonomous individual. Autonomous, if you remember, a key feature of Jaynesian consciousness or conscious interiority is self-autonomy. Okay, so you can see that even the language is similar. The psychologization of society, so sort of an academic take on how Japanese society has become more well psychologized. The psychologization of society, why the need for trauma and healing. Again, a focus on emotionalism, a focus on not just mental disorders, but mental well-being. All right, so we see this. I think it's increasing in Japan. The power of knowing beyond the moral education of emotivism. The cage of self-control. How the soft iron cage of psychologism is used to control people. So now this book, obviously, they're using that word psychologism, and they're taking a negative, a highly critical view. The idea is that perhaps there's too much focus on the individual. And what's happened in postmodern societies is we have the illusion of self-control, but actually we're in an iron cage that is made soft, and therefore we're not aware of being imprisoned, but we are imprisoned, and we're being controlled by all this attention to therapism or psychologism. Again, that's very debatable, but I think it's very interesting, at least, that people are paying attention to this issue of psychologicality. So now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm talking about the professionalization. So an increase in psi organizations in Japanese history. So the idea here is higher levels of professionalized psychology characterize societies that are strongly centered on the individual. Not unexpectedly, correlation a correlation exists between variations in levels of institutionalized individualism and the prevalence of professionalized psychology. By the way, that is a picture of Motora Yujiro. I spent 2 chapters talking about his contributions to Japanese psychology. He's considered the father of Japanese psychology. He lived from 1856 until I think it was 1916, I think. In any case, I know he was born in 1856. He died relatively young, but he's a very important figure in not just the history of Japanese psychology, but in the history of Japanese social sciences in general. So Japan, like other affluent consumers, capitalist, democratic societies, is becoming a therapeutic society. It is following what some people have called the therapeutic imperative. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, again, it's very debatable. So we have an expansion of the mental health profession, an increase in psychotherapy, proliferation of counseling services, the popularity of psychology. Psychology is a very popular major. I don't know if it still is. When I was an undergrad, everybody it seemed had to take wanted to take a course in psychology. So the idea here is and I'll give some examples in a moment. We want to note the growth or the spread of the institutionalization of these psycho organizations. For example, psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry. So this is a chart that looks at the number of what I call psi organizations or associations that were established going back to the pre-war period. And so as you can see, around 1940, that was during the war, so it's not surprising you only have one that was established. 1950, you have 6. 10 years later, it doubles. 1970 went down a bit, but 1980, 1990 dramatically increased. So again, we're looking at numbers. I mean, we can debate the statistics, how convincing this is, but clearly, at least from a commonsensical point of view, we can see that there is more attention given to what we would call the psychological landscape. This information is a bit out of date. I don't know what's been going on the past 20 years, but in any case. So here are some examples of what I mean by Japanese psi organizations. You can see that they look at every aspect of psychology. Down in the middle, Japan Association of Sand Play Therapy, for example, Japan Dance Therapy Association. Some of these are more medical types of organizations. Some of them are very specific. For example, Japanese Society of Stress Management. More examples at the top: Japan Society of Vocational Rehabilitation. Again, I'm not going to go down all the each one here, but just to give you a general idea, Japanese Association for Morita Therapy. So Morita therapy is considered one of the main indigenous psychotherapies that was established in Japan. So in any case, more examples. So you can see many examples. Micro counseling. I'm not even sure what micro counseling is. Japanese Association of Traffic Psychology. That's interesting. Japanese Society for Animal Psychology, Japanese Society for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, just to give you some ideas. Some more examples. Okay. At the top, we see Japanese Society for Parapsychology. That's interesting. Japanese Society of Biofeedback Research. So you can see, if I think this is really convincing evidence, if we need it, to show how Japan very much is a psychologized society. Okay. So just to give another example, the emergence of school counselors in Japan. So of course, what's going on here is we are in Japan. They are therapeuticizing and psychologizing education. Traditionally, teachers were expected to be generalists. Schools did not employ specialists. Some years ago, 1965, School Education Counseling and Guidance Association endorsed teachers for performing school counseling and guidance. So they were not full-fledged school counselors, I suppose, but at least there was a recognition, that was a while ago, 1965, that there should at least be some attention to school counseling in the schools. But only relatively recently did this idea of a school counselor become popular. Originally, they were employed only on a part-time basis in schools. 1995, MEXT, that just means Ministry of Education in Japan. 1995 implemented a school counselor pilot project to address family violence, bullying, school refusal. And this was a revolutionary approach at the time. May not seem revolutionary to us. I mean, this was a while ago. But the idea was to bring outside specialists into the schools. They were, at the time, they were considering using the term clinical school counselor, but they dropped that idea. In any case, here, this is just an example of a book, Rethinking School Counseling, from Japan, obviously. So in 1996, 553 schools in Japan have school counselors. That's not a large number. There are a lot of schools in Japan. Offhand, I don't know how many schools there are in Japan. Of course, we have to look at them at different levels. But a year later, that doubled. So it's quite impressive. Now, 4,000 schools utilize retired teachers and youth group leaders designated as advisors in the classroom for easing children's minds. Actually, information is a bit old, right? This is like 13 years ago. So again, I'm going to assume that there are even more schools who are giving more and more attention to the mental well-being of students. So now to change gears a little bit, so now I mentioned this before, psychotherapeutic religions. When I first went to Japan, I went to do research on what is called a new religion in Japan, a group called Sukyo Mahikari. And at the time, I was actually interested in psychological anthropology. That's why I studied this group, Sukyo Mahikari. But at the time, I often thought, to what degree are these groups, these religious groups that are, especially what are called new religions in Japan. Most people who are not very familiar with Japan, when they think of Japanese religion, they think of Buddhism and Shintoism. But actually, in Japan, people who decide to become very religious many times will join what are called new religions. And that's a whole nother conversation for another day, perhaps. But I just want to at least introduce this idea of how religions in Japan, and I think in other places around the world too, have taken the place, or actual, no, I think it's reversed. But in any case, I'll put it this way, there's a lot of overlap between what goes on in religious institutions, in temples, churches, and then what is going on psychologically. And how do you draw the line? And the scholar, a Japanese scholar, Shimozono Susumu, has actually looked at this idea of psychotherapeutic religions. I'm not very familiar with what work he's done, but I'm just pointing this out. And traditionally, in pre-modern times, of course, the idea in religions, not just Japanese religions, is that when a person was in trouble or they needed to be saved, they needed an intervention of some transcendental power of the other, called tariki in Japanese. You had to be saved by the Buddha, for example. Now in Japan, I think there are many people that are uncomfortable with absolute ethical norms. And the idea is that you don't need the power of another being or spiritual entity, some supernatural entity. Excuse me. Instead, you can rely on yourself. So it's more of a psychological view of religion in Japan. So the idea is not to. There's a preference, at least among these what are called new religions. I don't know how many there are. There's maybe 500-600 of these groups. I haven't been studying them for quite a while now. As I said, my dissertation was on a new religion. But the idea in these groups is that in order to be saved or to have your problems in this world solved, you don't want to rely on some divine entity that is distant and impersonal. Rather, you want something very personal. And in fact, it can be, as I said before, the idea is it could be yourself. Somehow you have to figure out how to save yourself. So these new religions encourage changing the individual's way of thinking. In other words, changing what we would call a person's psychology. The idea is to not necessarily change the world. So changing the world, I think, is an older pre-modern idea when it comes to religion. The idea is to start by changing the individual. So these new religions, rather than emphasizing the power of the other, they emphasize power of self, jiriki. And that Japanese scholar, Shimozono, gives examples. He gives many examples. But one example he gives in particular is what is called Nikon therapy. Nikon therapy was developed by a Japanese businessman. He was also a Buddhist, Yoshimoto Ishin. And his mother was a fervent follower of the Pure Land Shin sect of Buddhism. And as I said, Yoshimoto himself was a Buddhist. And the idea within, just to go back, within that the Shin sect of Buddhism, the idea was to that the people were searching for salvation, and the idea is that they were gyoni, patients, which is more of a medical term actually. But in any case, they would practice self-inspection under the guidance of what were called kaigonin, or enlightened ones. And the point of the exercise, or the spiritual exercises, was to experience a concentrated mind. Exactly what that means, of course, that may be a little bit mystical. But the point is, as you can see, there's an overlap with what we would call psychology. And so Yoshimoto developed a form of intensive meditation, and he called it Nikon, a method of inner observation, to see into oneself. So, and that's what that Japanese term means on the right side of the slide. Sometimes we translate it as introspection, but so you can see how this particular type of psychotherapy called Nikon grew out of a religious tradition. So the point is to change one's attitude toward others by reflecting on one's failings, specifically one's mother and maybe other family members, and to cultivate feelings of gratitude under the guidance of Shidosha, which might be translated as counselor. It means, I think, more like someone who guides us. But in any case, so that's the end of my talk. So hopefully there's some food for thought there. And I want to thank everyone for paying attention.
All right. So folks, it's time for Q&A. I'll ask a couple of questions and then open it up for questions. Again, let's focus on questions at this point. And you can go ahead and type an exclamation mark in chat if you would like to ask a question. Try to be brief. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything courteously. All right. So there are several things that was really fascinating to me. Brian, this is really interesting because you're looking at another culture and you're trying to see the patterns across time. So the idea that focus on the psyche is relatively recent. It's a huge idea. People who live in America today, we kind of take that for granted, of course. And when we look at people of another age, like say the 18th century people, we just assume that about them. So I think this is very valuable to kind of notice that this focus on psychology is relatively new, and to trace it in two different cultures, in the West and in Japan. I think is truly fascinating. The other thing is that to see the shape of the focus on psychology, it's different in different cultures. The things that, for example, I'm really intrigued by the fact that there are lots of new religions in Japan. That's a very common thing when somebody wants to be religious, to go in for a new religion. Whereas in the West, you would go in for an old religion. You would just, there would be these institutions and you would just go there. So I think the way in which religion is practiced is different. So it's interesting to see the commonalities and differences. So I'm going to let people ask questions. Let's see. Okay, Deborah wanted to ask a very simple question. Is there it just occurred to me that she says Nikon and Nikon. Go ahead, Deborah.
Oh yeah, it's just, yeah, I don't know. I'm looking it up now and it might just actually be a name, but I was wondering if it's an optical company, if there is a connection. Like it might be a different kind of like vision thing, but I was just wondering about that, if you knew about that, Brian.
Right. So actually offhand, I'm not sure what the company name Nikon means. So someone, you could look that up, just Google it, I suppose. I don't think there's a connection there, actually. I think Nikon is just a name of a company that's different from Nikon.
All right, thanks.
Very good. If anybody else has questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. All right. So Brian, in terms of, you talk about Jaynes and increasing interiority. Another really fascinating observation today was that as the complexity of organization of society increases, the complexity of interior organization of the psyche increases. So there is a connection between that. So if you look at a person living in a tribe surrounded by, let's 30, 50 odd people that they've known all their life, doing pretty much what they have done for generations, what is going on inside their head in order to interact with that and in order to live is at some scale. And then suddenly you go into the modern context, especially after the 19th century, the complexity of the society increases dramatically. People are moving from farms to cities. The Industrial Revolution is in full force. World is changing, and there is so can you talk a little bit more about this kind of corresponding increase of complexity of society and the interiority?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is really the crux of the matter, because again, to step back and look at things in huge, grand historical perspective, Jaynes claimed that people became conscious during the collapse, the late Bronze Age collapse, where you had all sorts of political, economic turmoil, and people were forced to develop a new culture that gave us these features of conscious interiority. And so I think throughout history, there have been other periods where we had similar major disruptions, and people had to rebuild, and they had to come up with new forms of knowledge to deal with, how do we relate the individual to society? Basically, that's what psychology is all about. How does the individual psyche relate to other people? And I think, especially in the 19th century, you saw massive changes. The problem in history, it depends which historian you ask, because each historian will say, no, 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 there were major changes in the 12th century. There were major changes in the 15th century, the 16th century. There are always going to be major changes. So these things are very difficult to measure, of course. But my personal feeling is that it's certainly easy to see what was going on in the 1800s. And in the 1800s, you had industrialization. And industrialization meant people had to work in new economic organizations. They had to be schooled because they had to acquire all types of relatively advanced hypothetical knowledge and information. They had to learn to read, to write. They had to at least learn basic math. This is all going to change. It's going to reconfigure the psyche dramatically. And that's what happened. And also, as societies became larger, the organizations within societies became larger. So the chains of command, the chains of communication became longer. And basically, we had to deal with more voices in our head, to use a Jaynesian expression. Of course, they weren't voices of gods, but they were voices of teachers, voices of our bosses, our supervisors, voices of politicians. There were just more layers of hierarchy. Because societies became bigger and more complex. And so this is what led to this ramping up of interiorization. So I think interiorization, conscious interiorization, really jumped for most people in the 1800s. I think if you go back in time, maybe in the 17, 16, 15, 1400s, there were certain individuals who were well schooled, who probably had a fair amount of conscious interiority. I don't know. I'm thinking of geniuses, people like Leonardo da Vinci, probably. But conscious interiority was not at the mass scale as it is today. And basically, that's what happened. But because of economic and political changes by the 19th century, people, the masses, it wasn't good enough just to have a scribal elite or a well-educated intellectual elite. Masses of people had to be imbued with conscious interiority, and we're living out these changes now. We're witnessing what's going on, with advances in technology. And so in any case,
folks, I want to share this graph of population. You can see the hockey stick graph. The 19th century, it just kind of, it just takes off like that. So it's a dramatic change in the world. All right. So, I mean, another aspect I want to look at in terms of conscious interiority is, like, for example, you talked about like the old world versus new world. So in many ways, like for example, I think of India, right? The focus on the individual is different across, across cultures and across time. So can you talk a little bit more about that? So like when you look at Japanese literature, whatever information we have about older Japan and newer Japan, what differences do you see?
Well, I think the differences are probably, we'd see the same differences in a place like India, in if we talk in very general terms. And so we are not going to see mass schooling. There's no need for it. As I said before, you'll have some education but it's going to be restricted to an elite. And I think also in pre-modern times, it's not just economic differences, right? So because when we have economic differences, it leads to industrialization, post-industrialization, social scientific breakthroughs that increase, that come faster and faster, and that all is going to change our psyche. But another important difference besides economics is politics, political. So in the pre-modern world, of course, people did not vote. There was no notion, even in the Western world, no modern notion of individual rights. And so when you stop and think about it, uh, changes in politics the past 100, 150, 200 years also reflect this increase in conscious interiorization. Um, so again, is one of these things we take for granted. But when you stop and think about it, it's very interesting. We assume that rights should be within the individual, that somehow an individual is born with what they call natural rights. But why is that the case? Why can't we talk about, in fact, in some places around the world, they still do talk about group rights or rights of the collectivity. But it's more of a very modern, postmodern idea to view the individual as having rights, to the point where the individual, in theory, can stand up to the collectivity, can stand up to the government, which is not always, doesn't always work out well for individuals, but at least there's a theory there. And so what I'm trying to say is the idea of individual political rights, constitutional rights, that is a very psychological notion. That indicates a big psychological change in how we view the human nature.
But Brian, that idea is kind of enshrined in the US Constitution, and that's like 18th century. So,
Right.
I mean, and there is a lot of discussion about that kind of, the Declaration of Independence has it and all of it. So in what sense do you see, so tell me about what is it that they had and what is it that is modern?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So when I talk about a philosophy or a politics of individual rights, of course, that you can trace that back to the Middle Ages, and you start to see in England this idea of what we would call rights. However, the idea is that, I mean, there's, I suppose, there was a vague religious idea that everyone has some sort of right, but really political rights were restricted to the property class or to aristocrats. Their rights were the ones that mattered. And by the time you get up to the late 1700s, during the Enlightenment, there is a lot of talk. I mean, it is enshrined in not just the American Constitution, other constitutions. People always point to the American Constitution, but actually other places you start to have this discourse of individual rights, not democracy though, not voting, right? That would come later in the late 1800s. But originally, the idea, the big political change that had psychological implications, was that the individual has rights. But as we know, even in the case of America, those rights were very much restricted to males and to whites and to property owners. So there were three things. You had to be male, you had to be white, and you had to own property in order to vote or in order to exercise your rights, really. And so it was still, even in the 19th century in America, there's still this medieval idea of that you belong to some sort of group, some sort of collectivity, where your political freedom was quite limited. And even in Russia, for example, I mean, we don't even have to get into slavery in America. I mean, that's clearly up until the early 1860s. Clearly there was no universal, because of slavery. On paper, there may have been a notion of universal rights, but in practice and reality, people didn't really believe that. They only thought that certain people should be allowed to exercise their rights. When you look at Russia, same thing with serfdom, right? Serfdom was not outlawed until the late 19th century. So those are just some examples. And so when we talk about rights, we have to look at the particular trajectory in a particular place. And sometimes we get, even very well-educated people kind of get confused sometimes, right? This idea of rights. That, I mean, in my lifetime, Blacks in America, their rights were very much restricted until the 1960s. That's my lifetime.
Mhm.
So you can see that these very ancient old ideas of privilege, medieval privilege, still haunt
Mhm.
no matter how modern the world is. We're still struggling with this. So we can see how politics and psychology intersect in these discussions.
Wonderful. Can you go ahead and share back your slide? There is a slide where you're summarized everything about the increasing focus on psychology. I think it was the third slide, second or so, one of the first few slides.
Okay.
Folks, your questions take priority over my questions. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and type exclamation mark. So it was, let's see, which one was it? It's, if you could go further. There was a slide where you're summarized, for example, all the characteristics of conscious interiority as one of the bullet points.
All right. It wasn't this one.
No. If you, I'm seeing only the first slide right now.
Oh, oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. It's not. Wait a second. I have to. Okay. Is it sharing?
Yes, it is sharing.
Okay. So was it this one?
Yes. Okay. So let's look at this, because this, I think, summarizes many things. And questions from the attendees take priority over my questions. So it's going to be Francoise.
Yes, my question is about the individual psychology and the group psychology, because I'm a little bit confused. At one time, that seemed to be very separated. You know, you mentioned very clearly that whatever history was coming was related to individual psychology. And then if we consider the group, you know, like corporation, gang, or society, we come back to a more general and a group itself. So it seems that a lot of time those two things are mixed. And how do we differentiate them? You know, and is there a lot of studies about the group psychology where the groups are more or less manipulated by psychologists?
Okay, so let me try and answer that. And if I'm not answering your question, let me know. But so the idea is that as a society becomes bigger, or as groups, organizations within a society become bigger, more complex, there's more hierarchy, that is going to actually increase conscious interiority. It's actually going to put more focus on the individual, because as the social structure changes, our psychic structures also have to change to keep up with organizational complexity. Okay, does that answer your question?
Well, more or less, because I'm still a bit confused of the interchange, and but it clarifies definitely part of it. Thank you.
Right. I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that there really is no difference between society and the individual. They're so entangled. And so what happens in one impacts the other. But with that said, I think we can make the argument that really, in a sense, the social structure is primary, because we are born into social structures. And those social structures are going to shape our psychology, our psychic structures. Those organizations, whether it's schools, corporations, governments, whatever type of organization, will demand from us to change our psychological processes. And something else I would add, one other point I was trying to make is that increasingly in the modern world, organizations are giving more and more attention to individual psychology. I mean, so schools, for example, have an example I gave in Japan. there's more attention given to the mental well-being of students. Corporations, business corporations now have mental health days. Many corporations are recognizing the importance of mental well-being for their employers or employees. I mean, you could make the argument, well, they're doing that because they want to make sure their employees are working hard so the company makes more profit. But, you know, in any case, the idea is that everything is increasingly being seen through the lens of psychology.
Brian, there are multiple questions, so can you stop sharing the slide?
Sure.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Jeff, Brian, and Katie. Jeff.
Hey, Brian. Man, the questions you lead us into are, are deep. Francoise, I want to kind of almost ask a similar question there. It just seems to me that there is some relationship here between independence and maybe autonomy in forming one's identity and values and sense of who we are and the purpose in life, and for what might be somehow kind of optimal psychological health. And there's a relationship between that and somehow our interdependence, and our relationships, whether those are our one-on-one relationships in our families, or whether there are, employers in our neighborhoods and our countries and even the world. And just as sort of a side to that, one of the things that's intriguing to me is that as the world has become more complex, and with the introduction of the internet, I actually thought it would lead to everybody being exposed to ideas and people who were different from them, because obviously there's an opportunity to get to know the whole world and a whole world of ideas. And I'm struck by how much of the internet is devoted to people finding others who agree with them and who are like them. It seemed to have been at least equally, if not more greatly, a tool for finding people who are like you than finding people who might inform you because of their differences.
Yeah, so is that just a comment about I mean, I'll try to respond to your comment. So anytime you have a new technology such as social media, of course we know there's going to be a negative and there's going to be a positive. And so of course social media, as you pointed out, gives us the opportunity to share, to meet with people who agree with us. But I think the negative is that it reinforces our own little universes, our own individualized universes, our bubbles, because it's so much easier, it's more fun, I suppose, to hang out with people and to listen to people who agree with us. It's, for many of us, it's not that much fun to force ourselves to be challenged by people who disagree with us. And so that's sort of the negative side to social media. And to get back, when you first started to give me your comment, you talked about independence and interdependence. And this gets really complicated because I think that these two things are interlinked. And we sometimes feel that we're becoming more independent when we consume something, when we engage or participate with social media. We feel that we're exercising our self-autonomy, which is a key feature of conscious interiority. But at the same time, we're becoming more interdependent. And oddly, they seem to mutually reinforce each other, independence and interdependence via technology. And so I don't, there doesn't really seem to be a good antidote to how do you break that chain between independence and interdependence. We pay a very heavy price. In the United States, in Europe, they have some legislation trying to protect privacy that's more sophisticated than we have in the US. I mean, in the US, we've lost so much privacy. So we've gained some independence, but we're in a bad way connected to and it's like you use the word, I suppose, interdependent with people who wish us harm. And so this is a real paradox of modern technology.
Excellent question and point, Jeff. Thank you. Next up is going to be Brian Alabi, followed by Katie. Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Coming at a bit of a tangent here, the new religions you mentioned, are they based on Buddhism, Shintoism, etc., or are they more like the personality-based cults you get in the USA?
That's an important question. That's a good question. So most of these new religions in Japan are very much influenced by Shintoism, Buddhism, and also, very importantly, they're influenced by what we might call Japan's folk tradition. And that folk tradition is about things like spirit possession and what we might call magical practices. So you have different influences feeding into these new religions. Some of these new religions, they borrow ideas from Christianity, they borrow ideas from Islam, from Hinduism. So you have a real mix. Some of these groups are very syncretic. And when I started to first do research with this one particular group, many Japanese would have actually a negative view of new religions. And the first thing they would ask me, were you brainwashed? Are you part of a cult? And, you know, I would say that most of these new groups are not cults, you know, assuming if you're using cult in a negative way, some of them are, you know, but I think with any religious organization, there's a thin line between being, for lack of a better term, a bona fide religious spiritual organization and a cult. Where do you draw that line? And, you know, in the case of Japan, if you remember, I was in Japan at the time in 1995 when a group called Om tried to kill tens of thousands of people with nerve gas. Fortunately, they only killed, I think, about a dozen people, and they did injure lots of other people with the nerve gas. But that's an example of clearly that I would judge as a cult. But to emphasize, most of these new religions in Japan, I would not describe them as cults.
Next up is Katie.
So I have two questions. My first question is, you talk about therapists in school, and I'm wondering whether there's any difference in how they practice it between Japan and the US. Like, do they analyze like the relationship with your family? What are the things that they're looking into mental well-being? And my second question would be about Shintoism. Like they also had that not wanting to change the world thing, not having missionaries. And I wonder whether you had any thoughts on why they were more insular and not wanting to change the world as opposed to focusing on themselves.
Okay, thank you. So those are two good questions. So as far as school counselors in Japan, I actually can't really answer that. I'm not that familiar with what they do in the schools, but I can speculate that probably they are probably they're going to look at things from more of a group perspective. What I mean by that, what is going on with the family. I mean, we do that in the United States too. School counselors, of course, you know, coming from especially a social work tradition, are going to pay attention to the larger environment, what's going on, other problems in the family. So that's not a particularly a Japanese way of doing things. However, I do think in Japan, perhaps there's more of a focus on the students' larger social environment. And the idea is that in Japan, this is where the groupism does come in. If you're a student in a school in Japan, you are definitely considered part of a group. And so the relationship is between the student, the other students, the teachers, and the counselor. Where in the United States, There is a difference. I think in the United States, we take a much more individualistic view of a student if a student has some problems. So in any case, that's not a very satisfactory answer, I'm sure, but that's just sort of my general impression. To get back to your second question on Shintoism, so I think if you look at religions from a worldwide angle, some religions proselytize, some religions don't, for whatever historical reasons. It depends on a lot of things. I think I don't like to use the term Westerners, but just for the sake of argument, certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or the Abrahamic tradition, I suppose, where you had Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Of course, those are well-known traditions that proselytized. We're very familiar with that. But some religions don't necessarily proselytize. In the case of Shintoism, I think one reason why Shintoists don't have a tradition of proselytizing is because Shintoism is not a universal religion. Shintoism has its roots in being Japanese, and especially beginning in the 19th century, Shintoism very much was politicized and was tied into the emperor and loyalty to the emperor. And loyalty to the emperor meant the same thing as loyalty to the Japanese group, to the Japanese empire. And so I think in Shintoism, you still have that tradition that being a Shinto, to be Shinto is you have to be Japanese. I don't know if that's true now, though. I think there are people who practice Shintoism. They're not necessarily ethnically Japanese, but certainly there's a very powerful political coloring of what Shintoism is in Japan. And so that's why, at least historically, Shintoists saw no reason to proselytize outside of Japan, or certainly before the war, they would not have proselytized outside the Japanese empire. But it gets a little bit complicated. I'm not sure. Actually, during the occupation of Korea and parts of China, I know that Japanese students, of course, had to bow to the emperor, who was considered a god. And I would think that the Korean subjects of the Japanese empire also would have to have shown some loyalty that may seem to us to have been religious, that may have been within some sort of Shintoist context.
Thank you. Next up is Jeff.
So Brian, I was reflecting on one of the fantastic things about this journey you've led us on is it's a little bit like when you get to visit another country that's really different from your own, and you get to see all the things that are different that you otherwise take for granted, and how you think and how people interact. And I feel like you've taken us on this amazing journey that's allowed us virtually to visit Japan, obviously through your eyes and your experience. But I just really want to thank you for that. I've never been to Japan, but I feel more like I have been there because I've been listening to you and getting the benefit of your stories and examples and presentations. And it's even like, I feel like I got to visit Japan with somebody that I know there, who could actually tell me about it rather than just going as a tourist. So I just want to thank you for that. I'm sure that's part of what was behind Shrikant's, continuing invitation for you to serve us in this way. But you're just amazing at it, and I want to thank you so much for it.
Thank you.
Second, in your just because of the richness of everything, your experience and education and wisdom and skills in psychology, I'm wondering if in this way of somehow managing, our individuation as well as our relationships. I'm a great respecter of questions. Are there any kind of core questions that you think kind of make sense, as on a daily basis, things we might be asking ourselves in order to navigate our way through the combination of individuation and some kind of autonomy, as well as interdependence in our relationships?
That's a very, very big question. Probably some thoughts will come to me later on in the day. Now that you've asked it, I mean, the only thing I can think of are just things that sound like cliches. Just get to know ourselves, pay attention to what we actually do enjoy in life and focus on that, and just have an open mind, and don't be taken in by superficial descriptions of independence. Don't think that I think in America, what's happened is many people think that freedom, they equate freedom with economics. They equate freedom with consumerism, buying things. I'm not, nothing against consumerism per se, but what's happened in America, I think, is we have forgotten that independence, self-autonomy, freedom, these things are actually political. They're not just economic. And we see that happening in China. And I say this because years ago, I started out as a sinologist. And I remember people being so excited about changes in China because of economic transformation. But I used to say to myself, you're only talking about half of the equation. There are many countries around the world. Russia is a good example, where you have tremendous economic, you've made some progress since the fall of communism. There are other examples, but that does not mean that things are where they should be politically. And I suspect that some American elites are forgetting that idea too, that there is such thing as, you can be poor and still be politically free. Not that I recommend that, but I think people are kind of mixing up values, and we're a bit confused. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what am I as a human being? What am I getting out of this life, and how am I going to do it? Am I going to do it just by focusing on the economics of my life, or am I going to ask myself harder questions? And also, speaking of harder questions, don't be afraid to ask hard questions, existentialist questions about who I am, where I came from, where I'm going. A lot of people are afraid of those questions. But I think when we start to ask those questions, it leads to some very rich revelations.
Wonderful, thank you. And I want to second, Jeff's comment about you being a great guide. But I want to enlarge that metaphor a little bit more. Normally, when guides take you to Japan, like you're in Japan, you're seeing things, and we are certainly seeing things. They show you only things that are external. Here, you're taking us into the psyche of Japan. You're taking us into many institutions and how it is put together. You're taking us into the history of Japan. And so it's like the domain that you're showing us is much larger. Okay, that's one. Second is that you are like a guide who is a native, in the sense that who have spent enough time there to know the place very well. And third, which is actually very unusual, is that guide is from our town. So the thing is that you are able to relate everything that you are seeing, both at a psychological level, organizational level, perceptual level, historical level, to the experience and ideas and the context that we have. So that's why it is particularly special. Also, most of the people who look at a culture look at just one aspect of it. I mean, one of the things that is unusual about your approach to Japan is that you are looking at it in a comprehensive way. You're looking at so many different aspects, and you're trying to relate any aspect, like cuteness, for example, to, like history of psychology. It's like you're trying to, the range that you're covering is incredible. So I think this is very, very special. So thank you very much. I want to ask you a question, which is a big question, because the main thing that we're doing here is Julian Jaynes' idea. And one of the astonishing ideas of Julian Jaynes, which it took me a little time to get used to, is his idea that consciousness is developing, is that human consciousness, by what he means, the conscious interiority, your self-awareness, is actually progressing. It has progressed significantly in the last, since 3,500 years, and then again a jump like 500 BC, then again a jump. And we are actually in the midst of a significant rise in consciousness, and we are not spectators of it, but participants and creators of it.
Mhm.
And given that we are able to communicate with each other as much, if anything, the speed of development of consciousness is much larger. And as you're saying, many people look at the history of development, of physical development, of the wealth of population, things like that. Talking about the development of consciousness is more difficult, but it is very real. So could you talk a little bit about Jaynes' concept of the fact that our consciousness, human consciousness, is developing, or our conscious interiority is developing? What do you think?
Right. So, yeah, that's a very big question. And, like I said, I'd have to really think about that for a while to give, I think, a good answer, or some good answers. But I think one way to view it is through the lens of mental well-being. And in my earlier talks, I talked a bit about that, about taking the word or the concept of conscious interiority and breaking it down into a bunch of different features, and asking ourselves how we can apply those features, or ask, for example, in a counseling setting, not just a counseling setting, but just in general. We have to make a distinction between having a mental disorder or not versus mental well-being. So there are many people who have mental disorders but are doing very well mentally. Because I think they have cultivated some of these features, whether it's a strong sense of self-autonomy or self-reflexivity, self-narratization, self-individuation. All these things, all those words mean specific things. And so I would suggest that not that I have figured it all out yet, of course, but to break consciousness down and tie it to mental well-being that can be applied in different settings. And the other thing is, Jaynes, this doesn't answer directly your question, but I think it is related. Jaynes, I'm not sure what his religious beliefs were. I think he was maybe an agnostic. But what's interesting with him is his father was a minister, Unitarian minister. And actually, his father published a book. And I haven't looked at the book in a while. I should go back and review it. But I think there's probably a connection between Jaynes' father, these sort of big spiritual questions that Jaynes' father was asking, and then what Jaynes himself asked about where are we going. And you can't understand where we're going unless you look at where we came from in terms of evolution and cultural historical development. And of course, that's what Jaynes was doing. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way, Jaynes would probably turn over in his grave with what I'm going to say, but it's difficult for me not to think that there is not a religious, but a spiritual angle to what Jaynes was saying about where are we going to go in the future as a species. And at a few conferences, Jaynes was asked that question: what is the future of consciousness? What will it become? What will we become as beings? And he shied away from answering it. He said, I have to be honest, I don't know, but probably there will be big changes. And so to me, that's what's so exciting about Jaynes, Jaynesian studies, is that these questions are unanswered. As you said, we're living through them right now. And it's very exciting to sort of wonder and to at least speculate to a degree, 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now, where are we going to be? as a species, as really the only creature in the universe that has this incredible thing called conscious interiority.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. All right, Brian. So, there are so many questions, so many things to explore. So folks, we're going to continue this next Saturday at 12 o'clock. I want to tell you about a special meetup at 5 o'clock today. Bill Rowe, Bill Rowe is going to be here, and he's going to be talking about development of consciousness in children, advent of consciousness in children. Brian, you know Bill well, so could you talk a little bit about Bill and the topic?
Yeah, so actually I'm not very familiar with the topic, but I can just introduce Bill. Hopefully I won't say anything that he disagree with, but Bill is a trained physicist. He's worked on big scientific projects, actually. So he has the mind of a real careful scientist. And so that's why when you meet someone like Bill, if he says something about Jaynes, for example, that there is some validity to what Jaynes argued, probably you should listen to someone like Bill. Bill is a soft-spoken guy, but he's actually published on historical developments to sort of flesh out what Jaynes had to say. So he has done some original research on Jaynes. And I think what's important about Bill is he is an example of someone who, because he's not in academics, understands Jaynes. Because Shrikant and I were talking about this earlier today, but I think what happens is people who go into academics become over-specialized. And what happens is they fail to be able to communicate with other people in other fields, and they fail to connect the dots. But Bill is someone who is able to do that. And so I'm looking forward to his talk today.
Wonderful. Folks, also we have a meetup at 2:30 on Louis Sullivan. So I'm going to close the meetup for now. And so we'll hope to see you at 2:30 or 5 o'clock. Tomorrow, we got two really interesting meetups. The first one at 2:30 is going to be on trivium. Marshall McLuhan did his thesis on the trivium. Trivium is the system of education that the West used for over 2,000 years. This is grammar, dialectics, and rhetoric, starting all the way from Greek to the 19th century. It was a dominant method of education. So Marshall McLuhan has very deep observations about that. So that's going to be at 2:30 tomorrow. And at 5 o'clock tomorrow, Aidan Moore will be back in his Practical Jung series, and he'll be talking about the difference between directed thinking and fantasy or dream thinking. All right. Hope to see you soon. Bye. And thanks, Brian.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye.